I wanted to talk a bit about Nigeria, as we mentioned then, but also come on to some of the nuts and bolts of how kleptocracies within Africa thrive based on the natural resource industries. Oil, yes, but also diamonds and ores and minerals and base metals. And in January 2010, when I was the Financial Times correspondent living in Lagos, I went up to the north. It was a moment of, as it frequently is in Nigeria, it was a moment of political turmoil. And I got a phone call saying there's something awful that happened in a city called Jos in central Nigeria. So between the largely Islamic north and the largely Christian south. And we drove down to Jos through checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint. And on the outskirts of the city, it was immediately apparent that something horrific had happened in Jos, as periodically does every few years in that otherwise beautiful city up on the plateau of the middle of Nigeria. We went through the city, a curfew came down, and the next morning we made it out to this village, which is called Kurukarama, just outside. And this is one of the few pictures from that village on that day that I could possibly show in this room. A mob had come down out of the hills, and they'd killed old men and women and children. They'd pushed their bodies into wells, and they'd burnt some of them in their houses. This is just one corner of that scene. And it's very easy to think and to write, as a lot of Western reporters do, at least, of instances like this in the poorer parts of Africa, that it's to portray it as though it's some sort of primitive explosion of hatred, some sort of tribal rage that could never happen anywhere else. You look closely, as I tried to do, at something like that. I stayed on for a few days, spoke to as many people as I could on both sides of what is an ethnic division, and you realize there's something very different going on, really. Fundamentally, what's happening is competition for a little bit of the pot, the enormous pot of oil money that lubricates everything in Nigeria. And its capillaries spill down from the middle into federal politics and then into politics at every level. And what happens in places like Kurukarama and Jos is that local political leaders are prepared to do anything. They're prepared to weaponize ethnicity and religion to retain their connection to that pot of oil money. And it's a life and death struggle. This goes all the way up to the top. This is a few months later. That's good luck Jonathan there on the screen, as Philip was saying, shortly to finish a pretty unsavory stint as Nigerian president. This is the primary at which he was picked by the ruling party, the People's Democratic Party. And he won that primary because the party gave $7,000 to every one of these delegates in an envelope. So much money moved hands that the Naira exchange rate changed. And it's a pantomime. This is not democracy in action. This is a ruling elite, admittedly in Nigeria quite a large one, fighting its own internal battles at the top level. And why does this happen? Why is there this facade of democracy over what's effectively a deeply corrupt state? It's because, I think, and I try to argue in the book, it's because of the nature of a petro-state. We'll hear about Russia and Venezuela. It's not limited to Africa, but that's what I know. In Nigeria, 70% of the government's income comes from oil and gas. It's oil and gas rent. It's foreign companies drilling in the Niger Delta or offshore, paying money straight into a central pot. 70% of government's income comes from that. 4% of the government's income comes from taxing the population. A negligible amount. It's a similar structure in Angola, it's a similar structure in Cameroon and Gabon and Equatorial Guinea and Africa's other petrostates. In Sudan, it's 98%, in South Sudan, forgive me. When that's your political economy, the basic contract of a state breaks down. The contract between rulers and ruled breaks down. If I'm in a position of authority in Nigeria, if I'm inside that clique, I have no need to appeal to your consent to rule. I have no need to appeal to your consent. I have no need to offer a record of public service. I just need to keep the oil money flowing. And that hold that people have in countries where the government is funded broadly by the population doesn't exist. If we withdraw our consent from our governments in Western Europe, they would collapse. If a Nigerian withdraws his consent from Nigeria, nothing happens. And what emerges instead, does anybody know who the man in the yellow tie, the Chinese man, is? What emerges instead are shadow states. I know as I traveled through mainly West and Southern Africa for the book, again and again, people from top political analysts to guys whose wells had been poisoned in the bush, they would reach for some sense of a shadow state or a parallel government or something that sits behind the facade of the state. So yes, in these African petro-states, there's a finance ministry and a central bank, and there's a defense ministry, and they do, to a greater or lesser extent, wield some power, but ultimately it's the presidential cliques operating behind that, much like the one in Angola known as the Futungu that Raphael's done so much to expose. It's in these shadow states that power resides, and they are not far off, distant, exotic ruling elites. They're intimately plugged into the world economy that reaches here. And to get there, to turn local kleptocracy into something global through the commodity markets, they need middlemen. And this is one of the big middlemen of Africa in recent years. He's the Chinese chap in the yellow tie and the black suit. And he's got at least 7 names and at least 2 passports, one of them an Angolan diplomatic one. He's best known as Sam, most people call him, or Sam Pa. And these days, as you can see, he's a big businessman, but he used to be a spy. That was how he got started. He worked with Chinese intelligence. He grew up in Hong Kong and worked with, we think, the civilian side of Chinese intelligence, and possibly the military side as well. And then he was in the right place at the right time, and in 2000, when Jiang Zemin sends forth Chinese enterprises into the world to find resources and markets and infrastructure contracts, they need people who know the territory. Sam has worked in the intelligence world and has some African connections, and he can open doors. And he jumps from being a spook, basically, to a tycoon pretty quickly. And he starts to develop a model, and it's by no means unique to companies coming out of China. It's replicated by business networks from all over the globe. He starts to develop a model of cultivating some of the most corrupt and repressive African governments and helping them to fuse their personal interests to the commodity markets, to harness the national patrimony of their country to the fast globalizing commodity markets, and specifically to China's rising demands. And he starts off with a man that Raphael has repeatedly annoyed, Manuel Vicente, who is Angola's Mr. Oil. He trained at Imperial College in London in petrochemical engineering, and he is the man who took Sonangol, the state oil company that Raphael was talking about, and turned it into a machine for making money to let the government fight its side in the civil war, in the Angolan civil war. After they won the civil war, Sonangol was a pretty lean, totally opaque machine for making money, and it could be used to enrich Angola's rulers rather than simply to fight the war. Sam cultivated Vicente, and in around 2004, they create China Sonangol, which sounds like it's a joint venture between the Chinese state and the Angolan state, but in fact is Sam Pa's network of businesses and his kind of commercial allies forming a deal with Sonangol, and it's awarded about half a dozen initially, and then ultimately about 10 oil prospects off the Angolan coast, including some of the biggest. Isaias Samakuva, who's the main opposition leader in Angola, I interviewed him, and he explained to me that he thinks that China Sonangol, within this ultra-secretive business network that sustains Dos Santos and keeps the Angolan regime in power, Samakuva explained to me that he thought that China Sonangol was the key, was the heart of that, the thing that Vicente and Sam Pa built to harness a large part of the second biggest oil industry in Africa to their own ends. Having got his start, he moved on to someone who I think more of us will recognize, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. When Sam turned up, Mugabe had been forced into a unity government, forced to share power for the first time since 1980, after a particularly ruinous election. Sam, as best we understand it, offered as much as $100 million to Mugabe's secret police, the Central Intelligence Organization, and in exchange was given access to the diamond fields that lie in those beautiful plains of eastern Zimbabwe, going up towards Mozambique. Those Merengue fields are some of the richest diamond fields in the world, and they've been brought absolutely brutally under the control of the security forces. Again, a shadow state, completely detached from the finance ministry. When the opposition held the finance ministry, they repeatedly pointed out the fact that none of these diamond export revenues were coming into the formal state. And with using middlemen like Sam to harness the diamond trade for himself, and his allies and his party, Mugabe was able in 2013, through another heavily manipulated election, to regain absolute power. At the same time, Sam was building an alliance with this man, who's, anyone seen him before? Captain Musa Dadis Camara, a pretty eccentric, mid-ranking military officer in Guinea-Conakry. He took power in the Christmas coup of 2008. And for the months that followed, the military rampaged through Guinea. Guinea is one of the world's largest exporters of bauxite, from which aluminium is made, huge repository of iron ore, and some of the worst human development indicators in the world. Sam cultivated him. Manuel was sent help to forge the relationship, and Sam and his people announced with the junta a $7 billion deal, infrastructure, resources, covering a swathe of Guinea's resources through companies that were set up not in Guinea but in Singapore. And they announced it days after Dadis' security forces had massacred 156 opposition demonstrators peacefully demonstrating in the National Stadium and gang-raped dozens of them in public. This is the pattern that's emerged. I stress that Sam's network is just one of many, but it's one of the most extreme ones that have come to light. And one of the things I've tried to explain in the book, and it's one of the things that have come up again and again, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, is the extent to which it's a mistake, especially when talking about corruption in Africa, to see it as a uniquely African phenomenon, as again, with that kind of shrug of casual racism people often do, as something that is inherent to a continent. It stretches, especially over the last 20 years, far beyond. This used to be a barracks, and it's now Pacific Tower 2 at 88 Queensway in Hong Kong. It's a big sort of ring of towers. Lots of investment banks have their Hong Kong offices there. And on the 10th floor of that are two little offices where dozens of the companies in Sampar's network are registered, far from Zimbabwe or Angola or Nigeria. And that's why the handful of activists and reporters who've tried to piece together what's really going on call Sam's business network, stretching across Africa and now beyond, they call it the Queensway Group. And when you start to try to put it together, beautiful, I think you'll agree, it looks like this, which is one of my early efforts when I was trying to report on it. It was in fact commissioned by the FT magazine. They said, well, we'll have a lovely graphic to go with it, and I took them that and they told me to go away. But that's just the inner core of the Queensway Group. And crucially, Sam doesn't appear in any of the records. They've kept him at a distance, which is helpful for them because he's now on the US sanctions list for his activities in Zimbabwe. What's even more difficult to pierce is the ring around this, which is the layer of deep corporate secrecy, which is where these commodity deals, these oil and mining deals between these guys and the African countries where they operate, that's where they're channeled through secrecy. So the Queensway Group have offshore companies through which they channel their interest in the Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, in the British Virgin Islands, and in Delaware. And I can't stress enough the extent to which that is the crucial plumbing. Bill and Gustavo will know this, the extent to which financial secrecy is the crucial plumbing for the looting of fragile states. And most of this looting is conducted through these routes, which are in the Caribbean or London or Switzerland, again, very far from the African states where people suffer the consequences. Does anyone recognize that? That's the House of Morgan. The bank that JP Morgan built and commissioned for his bank that bore his name just before his death. And across the road there is the New York Stock Exchange. And if it wasn't obvious that this is the financial crossroads of the world, there's a tourist information sign just down there that says, "This is the financial crossroads of the world." That building, JP Morgan moved out a while ago, and from the early 2000s it was owned by Lev Levayev, who's an Angolan diamond dealer, primarily very active in Angola. And then he sold it. And it's now owned by Sampar's people. There's a pretzel vendor over there. This is, very much the slick end of New York, very far from the killing fields of Guinea or of the merengue fields in in eastern Zimbabwe, and yet these networks pierce the very heart of the financial world, and they've become truly global, so much so that in fact that front was used to double as the Gotham City Stock Exchange in the last Batman film. And just as a final thought, what we're talking about, I think, are increasingly transnational kleptocracies, networks that have become, yes, they're rooted in physical resources in the ground, and yes, they're rooted in holding political power in specific countries. But the people who wield that power are increasingly offshore themselves, and certainly their commercial dealings have shifted away. So it's very hard to find them and to identify them and to call them to account. And they're truly global and often hidden, but they are the thread that connects business interests here back to what happens in places like Kurukurama and the terrible game that's played at the coalface, if you will, of the resource business. And they are hidden and they are secretive, these networks, but they do exist. They can be they can be found, and like their victims, their beneficiaries have names. Thanks very much.